Greetings all, this is Rick Levine with your October mid-month update. When I did the October forecast, since I was in upstate New York at that time, I mentioned that was going to be a shortened version and that I would distribute this mid-month update to everyone. The mid-month update is normally reserved for the $3 a month subscribers on Patreon. You can make sure that you get additional mid-month updates in the future by going to patreon.com/Rick Levine. The link is down below, and that way you can be assured of getting the mid-month update, and that's $3 a month if you're interested. And of course, if you're at any of the other higher levels of subscription, you automatically have that mid-month update, or this mid-month update, included. So, with no further ado, I'd like to jump in, because this is an extraordinary period of time that we are looking at. The second half of October, but we're also going to look at the first week or so of November, all in one sweep. I know normally we stick pretty strictly to the month to month, but because so much of what's going on now will be leading to a culmination on Election Day in the United States, that's Tuesday, November 8th, which is also the second of the two eclipses. That's going to be a very significant time, and I thought that we would cover this whole period of time from now through Election Day. And I am recording this on Monday evening, October 17th, and I will hopefully have this edited and up and posted by Tuesday the 18th. That is my goal, and you never know, I never know what I'm going to run into when I get into the video editing portion of this. So, really what we have to talk about today is two eclipses in Mars. And I know that we've talked a little bit about this in the past, in the October forecast, but there's really an interesting story being unfolded, and this story really goes back to 2021, and really it's the beginning of 2021 as the Saturn-Uranus square is pushing toward its first exact square. And this is really tied up with the January 6th insurrection of the U.S. at the U.S. Capitol, and so we're going to kind of take a quick look at some of this history, because it's just so intriguing as we're now coming to this culmination. And I must say, going into this, like many of you, I'm kind of bored of the whole political scene, but it really is difficult to approach this period of time without looking at the politics, because everything is so tied up in that. And for the record, lest you think that I am pushing a particular party line, I certainly have my beliefs and my orientation, culturally, socially, politically, etc. I would like to read a sentence out of this book, which is the last book that Carl Jung wrote before he died, this book called The Undiscovered Self. And in it, he talks a lot about the relationship that we have. This would be in the mid-20th century when he wrote this book. The relationship that we have with churches and with government, and the idea that politicians are trying to solve the world's problems. I would just like to be clear that although I think in politics we have choices to make, and some people decide that they're not playing at all, they're not making any choices, they'll just, sit out the political game from the sidelines. I think we're at such a dangerous period right now that it is dangerous to sit this out, that it's important to register your perspective, whatever it may be. In this book, Carl Jung wrote, "I see it only as a delusion when churches try, as they apparently do, to rope the individual into a social organization and reduce him to a condition of diminished responsibility instead of raising him out of the torpid, mindless mass and making it clear to him that he is the one important factor and that the salvation of the world consists in the salvation of the individual soul." Basically, what Jung is saying here is that ultimately the solutions that we're looking for politically are not political. In some ways, politics and government are a projection of us individually, and as long as we have shadows, as long as we have dark, unresolved areas in our own psyches, we're going to be dealing with the problems that we seem to be facing culturally, and at least in the United States, but certainly it appears around the world that we are facing politically during these times. So, as we know, the Saturn-Uranus square exact 3 times during 2021 corresponded pretty much with the unfolding of the old versus the new, the authoritative versus the progressive, and in fact, there was the beginning of this was back in January of 2021. Now, if we go back to January 6th, 2021, we'll notice that Saturn and Jupiter are just separating from their grand conjunction that happened in December of 2020. And that Mars, on the day of the insurrection, just moved into 0 degrees of Taurus. And so Mars was moving toward an exact square with Saturn. And Mars was also moving toward a conjunction with Uranus. We have this Saturn-Uranus square pushing. And remember, the Saturn-Uranus square is exact for the first time on February 17th. But prior to that, we actually have the second impeachment of Donald Trump that begins on January 13th. And on January 13th, we have Mars having moved into Taurus, partile square, exactly square to Saturn, 3 degrees of Taurus to 3 degrees of Aquarius. And interestingly enough, that Mars is pushing toward its conjunction with Uranus, which certainly would indicate erratic energy and upheaval and even social revolution. But the impeachment begins on January 13th, and the impeachment concludes on February 13th. And what's intriguing here is that the first of the 3 exact squares between Saturn and Uranus is exact on February 17th, just within 4 days of the conclusion and the failed conviction of Donald Trump. And that was on February 13th, and the first exact square was on the 17th. Now, that square kind of became the theme for the entire year as sides were drawn. But what's interesting is that even though the exact Saturn-Uranus squares concluded on December 24th, or the 23rd, depending on where you live on the planet. The Saturn-Uranus square now are back to being very close again. I'm not going to talk about that in great detail today because I talked about that quite a bit on the October forecast. But let it suffice to say that Jupiter's presence, half a square to Saturn on one side and half a square to Uranus on the other side, really sets the stage for how important this not quite exact Saturn-Uranus square is, kind of really setting up a dynamic pattern. And again, I spent quite a bit of time on that on the October overall forecast. What I want to talk about today is how the energy is shifting, and yet it really comes to a culmination on Election Day on November 8th, because on Election Day on November 8th, there is a full moon eclipse on Election Day that is conjoined to Uranus. The moon, it's a Taurus full moon, and the moon is conjunct Uranus in Taurus. And Uranus is also square Saturn, and in fact, this whole pattern that we're looking at right now on November 8th is really shows the dynamic between the moon and Uranus and square to Saturn, and the moon's opposition to not only the sun but to Mercury. And because Venus is in the picture also at 20 degrees of Scorpio, that pulls in the Saturn even more, because it turns out that the Venus and Sun midpoint, the halfway point between Venus and the Sun, is very closely square Saturn. So the energies are really making this very, very intense. And if one were to read this chart just as a standalone chart, we can be assured that it will be a surprise. Why? Well, because it's an eclipse on Uranus. The moon is conjoined Uranus, and it's an eclipse. It's going to be a shock. It's going to be not what we expect. And it doesn't matter what we expect. It's not going to be what we expect. I believe that this is an incredibly difficult election to call astrologically, because of the shock value and the uncertainty, the unpredictability of Uranus in the picture. But there are a couple of things that are also here very, very important. And one of them involves Mars, which is quincunx to Pluto, and Mars is the thing that we're going to really talk about quite a bit, because between now and the end of the month and on into November, Mars plays such a pivotal role. Now, as I talked about in the October forecast, Mars is slowing down through October, and Mars turns retrograde at the end of October, on October 30th. And what's interesting here about the Mars retrograde is that normally Mars moves through about 20 degrees in a month. It takes about a month for Mars to go 20 to 22 degrees, actually, which means that in a couple of week period of time, Mars is going to move about 11 degrees. So by mid-November, by November 15th, Mars is pretty much back where it is today, where it is in the middle of October. It's almost as if Mars doesn't go anywhere. It goes a degree and a half forward and then a degree and a half backward. It's really just inching along. It's crawling, if you will. So let me just restate this again so you have the numbers in your head. On October 15th, Mars is at 24 Gemini and 7 minutes, just over 24 Gemini. On November 1st, Mars is at 25 and a half Gemini. And it's moving at about 5.5 minutes of arc a day. It's just barely creeping along. On November 15th, Mars is back to 23 and 3/4 Gemini, and it's moving about 8 minutes of arc a day. But that's nothing like normally it's moving about 45 minutes of arc a day. That's 3/4 of a degree, which means that when Mars is moving normally through the sky, it's moving 8 times faster than it is right now. Now, the reason why I'm belaboring this point is that we don't have to wait for Mars to turn retrograde to feel the heaviness and the sluggishness and the slow-moving energy that we're getting from Mars at this point in time. Mars in Gemini is supposed to be fast. It's distracted and distractible, but it's supposed to react very, very quickly. And yet, because it's moving so slowly, everything's taking longer than it should. And that can be incredibly frustrating, which, in fact, can build up even more heat. Because remember, when Mars is retrograde, it's closer to Earth. Mars is going to get brighter and brighter and brighter in the sky over the weeks and month ahead. And as it does, we will be quicker to anger, to establishing boundaries, to impulsive energy, because that Mars energy will be heating up. But it'll be heating up doubly because it's moving so damn slow, and it's frustrating, and so it makes us, or it encourages us to overreact. Now, the other thing I want to talk about here for a moment before we get into the day-by-day for the rest of the month is the fact that Mars, in this process of barely not moving, is holding on to a square to Neptune. Now, Mars made its first exact square to Neptune on October 11. Remember, Mars is moving through this period of sky that we call the shadow, which is from about 8 degrees of Gemini. It'll move to about 25 degrees of Gemini, where it then turns retrograde, backs up to 8 degrees of Gemini, and then moves forward again and through out the other side next spring. What this means is that anybody who has any planets between 8 degrees and 25 degrees of Gemini, that Mars is going to go over once, backwards twice, and then direct a third time. Now, what this also means is that Mars is going to make 3 squares to Neptune. The first one it already made on October 11th. Mars turns retrograde on October 30th, and Mars makes its second square to Neptune on November 19th. Then Mars turns direct in January, and then it makes its third and final square to Neptune on March 14th. That's obviously next year, 2023. But during this period of time, Mars spends a lot of time within a degree or two of that exact square. In other words, even though Mars made its first exact square with Neptune back on October 11th from 23.25 Gemini to 23 degrees Gemini, 22 minutes, and 23 degrees Pisces, 22 minutes. And if we were to look at where that Mars is right now, it's only at 24 degrees, 24.5 degrees. So it's barely moved a degree away from that exact square. And then by the time we get to November 1st, Mars will still be, it'll be 25.5 degrees. It'll still be basically within a couple of degrees of orb of being square to Neptune. And as Mars backs up by that November 15th, well, by November 19th, it'll be exactly square again. So what I'm trying to express here is that even though we look at the discrete exact aspect of Mars square Neptune back on October 11th, and then we look at the next one on November 19th, it really doesn't ever leave this square. And what is the Mars square Neptune? Well, it's confusion. It's the ability to either buy or sell an illusion. In other words, it depends on which side of the equation we're on, but we can actually convince someone else that what we are saying is true when it may not be, or someone else might be able to convince us that what they're saying is true even though it might not be. But there's also a dream and a kind of what's the word I'm looking for? There's a sense of fantasy and illusion about Mars Neptune, but Mars is physical, so we can act on our delusions or our fantasies without realizing it. And yet there's also a corrective value or potential for a corrective value here, because that square actually precipitates something that may correct a misunderstanding or a simple deception. The example that comes to mind is that within 24 hours of the exact square between Mars and Neptune on October 11th, in other words, on October 12th, Alex Jones was ordered to pay nearly $1 billion for the lies that he told about Sandy Hook. And about the families and the harassment and all and all of that. And so we have an event here that kind of is showing that there was some correction of a delusion or of a simple outright lie that was being told about that. But what's intriguing is that if we go back and we go back to September 2nd, 2021, Mars opposed Neptune, and on September 1st, within 24 hours of the exact opposition, Texas enacted the nation's most restrictive abortion ban after the Supreme Court failed to rule on an emergency request from Texas abortion clinics. Now, this was still prior to the reversal of Roe, but this was on September 2nd, September 1st actually, on the Mars-Neptune opposition. On the next Mars trine Neptune, on November 29th, the Supreme Court leaked information that made it apparent that they were going to uphold a Mississippi law that banned almost all abortions after 15 weeks of pregnancy. And this was like hit the news big. It wasn't a Supreme Court ruling yet, but it was like a foreshadowing of what was going to happen, and that was on the Mars trine Neptune. On May 17th, 2022, Mars joined up with Neptune. That was a Mars-Neptune conjunction. And within a few days of that, on either side of that, we had the Justice Department requesting all the transcripts from the House investigations from the January 6th committee. We had major shootings, mass murders in Buffalo, New York, and Uvalde, Texas. Those were very, very close to the Mars-Neptune conjunction. But you can see weaved in and out of this, we have again and again and again these events that keep coming up. Now, this is why this Mars-Neptune square that is holding from October 11th, or really even a week or two before then, all the way through mid-November is so intriguing because it might lead us to believe that we're going to see some sort of resolution or breakthroughs on these issues that are just intertwined, whether it be gun violence or abortion rights or information about people breaking laws and not paying the price for that. We may think that we're going to see some breakthroughs on all of that, and the fact is that I think we will. But again, we have to factor into this the fact we have to factor in the fact that Mars is moving so slowly and then retrograding that it's still going to take longer for things to make sense than we wish. Now, because Uranus is still a player in this, because that Saturn square Uranus is still such a powerful player, I still think it's too early to call what way anything is going to go here. And I know that frustrates people. People want astrology to have answers, and as far as I'm concerned, it just brings out the questions even deeper, and it makes us aware of how intricately the timing of what's unfolding now is tied to what's unfolded over the past couple of years. So let's now come back to charts. Let's look at a chart starting with the today with the 17th. So on Monday, October 17th, we have the Sun making a trine with Mars. And I think that this is a really interesting dance. There's a lot going on right now in the sky. If you look at the chart, you can see how close Venus is to the Sun and that Venus-Sun conjunction. They're traveling at very similar speeds. It takes a while for that conjunction to be exact, but that's feeding into this whole second part of October. But we can also see that the Sun and Venus are both moving into trines. The Sun-Mars trine is exact on the 17th, and the Venus-Mars trine is exact on the 18th. There's a bit of smoothness here that we could expect. However, we also have the quincunx of both Venus and the Sun to Neptune. The Sun quincunx to Neptune actually occurred on Sunday the 16th, and the Venus quincunx to Neptune is on Monday the 17th. And so although there's some smooth energy, there's also some things that are not quite right. They're not sitting right. And into all of this, we have a late Cancer moon that on Monday opposes Pluto and squares the Sun, and there's some dynamic energy here that's kicking the second half of this month off. By the 18th, we have that Venus moving into its exact trine with Mars, and we should be able to squeeze some sweetness out of this. We should be able to find a bit of respite in the noise that's going on. I mean, look, the Saturn-Uranus is not going away, and in fact, the Sun and Venus are both moving towards squares with Pluto. That Sun square Pluto is exact on the 19th in the morning, but we're going to be feeling it already on Tuesday. This is power struggle. This is stuff going on that's shady, in the dark, that's powerful, and yet we can't quite deal with it head on because we can't quite see it. And the Sun square Pluto on Wednesday the 19th, early in the day, and Venus, because it's so close to the Sun, is squaring Pluto later in the day, and this is a little bit of the Persephone story. We may feel as if we've been hijacked, as if we've been taken into the underworld against our will, as if things are going on that are not okay, and yet in that we can find a sense of power and reclaim our way back to the light, which I think is part of what this month is all about. We also have on Wednesday the 19th, Mercury forming an opposition with Chiron. This is old wounds coming into the surface, and it's about communication. This is about people saying things that perhaps are hurtful or mean even. And we also have the moon now in Leo. The moon actually entered Leo late on Monday night. And the moon now in Leo is forming a T-square opposing Saturn and squaring Uranus. And so we're going to get a buzz like we do every time the moon moves through the middle of a fixed sign. It either squares or opposes or conjoins Saturn and Uranus, stirring up that energy of the conflict, of that deep dynamic division that we have going on and that we've had going on for a long time historically, but certainly for the last couple of years in a very powerful and present way. Also on Wednesday, we have a whole series of septiles, and I'm not going to go into these deeply, but we do have Mercury forming a biseptile with Pluto, and the Sun a triseptile with Jupiter, and the Moon forming another couple of septile aspects. And this is just adding to the things that are not they're not knowable, and yet they're coming through. Because septiles are, in the words of Dane Rudhyar, the aspect of fate. And things are coming through from the unknown, from other dimensions, and it's like we can't shake it. Wednesday has a bit of mystery to it, and it's a bit of uncertainty and discomfort if we think we need to know everything, because there's no way that we can know everything, especially as we also have those squares to Pluto, and we're being abducted, dragged into the underworld, perhaps even against our will. On Thursday, the 20th, we have Venus again in a septile aspect. It's actually a triseptile to Jupiter. And again, I'm only mentioning these septiles because they seem so powerfully supported by what's going on. The moon makes 4 septile aspects throughout the day, and it's just, again, Wednesday and Thursday there's strange stuff bubbling, and we may not be able to put our finger on it. We may not be able to understand how everything fits together, but time will tell. On Friday, the 21st, is a astrologically quiet day. And again, the Saturn-Uranus square doesn't go away. It's not going away. It's just there. We have a lot of aspects that are building that are not exact until Saturday, and we may feel them on Friday the 21st. But it's not until early Saturday morning that Mercury makes an exact quincunx with Uranus. And this is abrasive, and it's information that we didn't know and we maybe don't want to know, but boom, there it is. Another lightning strike comes. The sky lights up. We can see things that we didn't see before. It's that aha experience. We also have the exact Sun Venus cazimi, or conjunction. Venus is in the heart of the sun, and the Arabic word for that is cazimi, and it's a very powerful day. It's a day of gratitude, of love, of grace, and yet it's even supported further by the fact that we have that Venus-Sun conjunction forming a biquintile, that's 2 points on a 5-pointed star, that the near opposite points, with Neptune, the planet of dreams and illusions and magic. And so I think that Saturday can be quite a powerful day and quite a beautiful day. We also have Saturn stationing on the 22nd, on Saturday the 22nd. We were on the 21st, but now we're on Saturday the 22nd. which is the day of all these other aspects that I've mentioned. But the Saturn station, Saturn is turning direct. It'll take some time for it to get going. But again, this re-emphasizes the importance of that Saturn-Uranus square, even though it's not exact, because all of a sudden we now have Mercury forming a trine also on Saturday, forming a trine with Saturn, stabilizing communication. It's like it's almost like in all the craziness on Saturday we get to pick one thing that's like, I would call it stable data. It's like, this is real, and we can make everything else kind of fit into place if we hold on to what it is we know. And I think on Saturday we do know something, but it's also a very creative and magical day. I like Saturday. The moon moves into Libra in the evening, and when the moon moves into Libra, it's eventually, over the next couple of days, going to conjoin Mercury and Venus and the Sun, as they're right now at 29 Libra on Saturday. They'll both be moving into Scorpio early Sunday morning. In fact, Venus moves into Scorpio just after midnight on Saturday night, early Sunday morning, and then the Sun moves into Scorpio at about 3:35 a.m. And of course, times as always are Pacific time. But Sunday is a shift, because all of a sudden the energy in Scorpio, we're playing for keeps. It's a bit deeper. It's a bit more intense, and what was a really what's the word I'm looking for here? What was a really easy energy and magical just a few days ago, with that Venus-Sun conjunction forming a biquintile, a five-pointed star aspect with Neptune. On Sunday, the 23rd, that Venus-Sun conjunction, having slipped into intense, passionate, play for keeps Scorpio, transformational Scorpio even, is forming a quincunx now, and that quincunx from Venus and the Sun is to Jupiter, which has retrograded back to 0 degrees of Aries. We're going to pay attention to that Jupiter, because it's going to slip back into Pisces in a few days, and as it does, it's going to also add to that whole feeling of Mars getting ready to turn retrograde, because Jupiter retrograding back into Pisces is going to feel regressive. It's going to feel like, wait, didn't we already do this? We're going back into the past. And that would be on Sunday the 23rd. On the 24th, we have that moon moving through Libra, as I said, it's conjoining Mercury in the morning, and then squaring Pluto. And although these are kind of fast aspects, I think they'll stir up energy just because they're powerful. The moon right now, because it's conjuncting Mercury and squaring Pluto both, I think brings up some stuff that's maybe difficult to handle, or difficult to acknowledge as truth. That's on Monday the 24th. On Tuesday the 25th, the moon moves into Scorpio, and now all of a sudden we have the Sun and the moon in Scorpio. We have that new moon in Scorpio that occurs on the 25th, and we'll get there in just a moment, or we'll back up to that in just a moment. But we have the Sun and the moon and Venus all in Scorpio. So we're now looking at the new moon eclipse, and this is the first of the two eclipses. The second eclipse is going to be on November 8th on Election Day, on that morning. But this Scorpio new moon eclipse at 2 degrees of Scorpio is conjoined Venus, also partile conjunct at 2 degrees of Scorpio. And what's interesting about this is that the closest aspect that this new moon eclipse is making is the quincunx to Jupiter. And so this is suggesting how fast we're moving along, or how much is too much. That Scorpio energy with Venus so close to the sun and the moon, it's powerful. We have a perspective now that we're willing to feel okay with, whatever our perspective is on whatever issue it is that you that you choose to talk about. That there's a sense of your values, Venus, are close to your heart, or maybe even a lower chakra, because it's not just heart, it's gut, it's survival. And yet, because this new moon eclipse is quincunx to Jupiter, we may get carried away. We may do too much. We may say too much. We may attract or put too much into our values. Venus, too much. There's that sense of overdoing it, overwhelm. And also in this, remember that Mars, which is inching forward so slowly, on October 25th, it's at 25 degrees 25 minutes. And on October 26th, it's at 25 degrees 29 minutes. It barely moves, 4 minutes of arc in an entire day. But that the thing about that Mars quincunx to Pluto is that this is a tough neighborhood celestially, because Mars and Pluto, co-rulers of Scorpio, and in fact we have on the 25th the new moon eclipse in Scorpio, and yet Mars and Pluto are not comfortable with each other. They're not directly fighting it out because they think they're playing with different issues, or maybe they're fighting in different wars, but they're not working together here at all. And that's a struggle. And what makes this even more of a struggle is that Mars never perfects this quincunx. I mean, it's within a little bit over a half a degree of orb, but Mars doesn't reach 26 degrees because it right now is moving so slowly, and we'll see that by the end of the month, Mars is stationed still in the 25th, in the 26th degree, but at 25 degrees and change of Gemini, and then it retrogrades back, so it won't reach a quincunx to Pluto until next spring. And so there's this thing of that fight, the depth and the intensity of that duking it out between Mars and Pluto is put off until next year. We don't get the satisfaction of having a clear-cut win here. Mars kind of pulls back and pulls away from the energy, but it doesn't do that for a few more days. But this eclipse is very intense. It's very powerful, and again, look how close the Mars is still square to Neptune. We still don't know what's going on. There's still this confusion and a complexity of knowing what the truth is, what's fake, what's real, and how the two are ever going to work out a common position. We also have Mercury coming into a quincunx with Neptune. Again, this is lack of clarity in information. The quincunxes here, I think, are quite important all over the place. And of course, then there's the never-ending Saturn square Uranus, which is, still there within about a degree of exact of orb, and so that's still holding its own, and that will be Tuesday, the 25th. On Wednesday, the 26th, the moon now moving through Scorpio opposes Uranus and squares Saturn. Remember, just a week ago, it opposed Saturn when the moon was going through Leo. It opposed Saturn and squared Uranus. Now it's opposing Uranus and squaring Saturn. Again, these lunar aspects don't last long, but they're stirring up the same stuff again and again and again. And you know, when we go through the same patterns again and again and again, it's like the engrams get deeper. The habit of those thoughts, of those rhythms, of those conflicts, of those ideas just kind of become more and more established. And so that's on the 26th. We also, though, on the 26th have a little bit of respite from Mercury's trine to Mars. It's like we get to talk about things in a way that's a little bit more flowing than the energy is. The energy itself is not flowing. The energy is kind of locked up here. And again, remember, in the United States, we're 2 weeks away from Election Day, but it's feeling, I think, it's getting more and more tense, and yet that Mercury trine Mars may be an example that's made by someone who publicly makes a statement and breaks through some of that locked up energy, because the energy sure is locked up. People cannot say what's really on their mind for fear of political reprisal. That is on the 26th. Early on the 27th, on Thursday, early in the morning at 3:54 a.m., the moon moves into Sagittarius. And the important thing about that, although the moon moving into Sagittarius can help take the pressure off of that Scorpio energy, can bring us up, it gives us the ability to take a deep breath, to look up and see the tops of trees, or or the stars, or whatever is up there. It pulls us out of ourselves, and that's cool. But the other thing is that as that moon moves into Sagittarius, it makes a harmonious trine with Jupiter, now at 0 degrees and 2 minutes. That 2 minutes, 0 degrees and 2 minutes, that's 1/30th of a degree into Aries. And it's retrograding, so it's backing up, and it will be in Pisces in a blink of an eye. In fact, by later this evening, on Thursday the 27th, Jupiter, by the end of the day, will back up into Pisces, but the moon makes a trine with it while it's still in Aries, so we get this uplifting energy. And then by the end of the day, that Jupiter pulled back into Pisces, where again we're pulled into a different land. And there's other energy that's going on this Thursday also, because now Mercury is making that exact square with Pluto. And again, this is negotiation. This is Mercury as the first shuttle diplomat to go down into the realms of the hell realms, into Pluto's or Hades' realm, and to negotiate Persephone's release for 6 months a year. But Mercury is negotiating now with that darkness. And it's interesting because in some ways that occurs early in the morning on October 27th. And then we have Venus making a couple of aspects, septiles and quintiles, that in some ways suggests that there's a little bit of magic cooking in the background. And then when Jupiter goes into Pisces, we have a sense of opening. We have a sense of even though we've gone backwards into some place that's comfortable. We feel at home because our spirit is comfortable when Jupiter is in its home sign, Pisces. Jupiter is very active in Aries. It's ready to say yes before we know what the deal is. Jupiter isn't as fast to move into something new while it's in Pisces, but we feel content because we're able to grow in one spot. I think it was Marcel Proust who wrote that the only true journey is seeing the same place through many different eyes, rather than seeing many places. And I think that Jupiter in Pisces kind of is that. It allows us to stay in the same place, but we go to a more spiritual or more magical place where our perspective changes what it is that we see. On Friday, the 28th, we have another relatively quiet day. And I say quiet not because there's nothing happening in our lives or in the news, but because there's not a lot happening astrologically with outer planet connections, but we still have a lot of assimilation, of integration with that, with Jupiter having just backed up into Pisces, and the Moon is quite active through the day, making just one aspect after another, and culminating in the late afternoon and on into the night with a square to Neptune and an opposition to Mars. I mean, there is some dynamic energy here in the afternoon and on into the evening, but I don't think it's overwhelming. I don't think that Friday is an earth-shattering, explosive kind of day. However, when we get to Saturday the 29th, and now look at Mars. Mars is still at 25 degrees. It was at 25 degrees in 24 minutes, and now it's at 25 degrees. This is like 4 days later. It's barely moved, in a cosmic inch. It's moved 12 minutes, 1/5 of a degree over the course of almost a week. And it's still going to be slowing down for the next day or two, although it technically is stationed. You can see the little S there, which means that Mars is making its station. But on Saturday, we have, again, an active moon. Early in the morning, the moon makes a series of septile aspects, bringing in that otherworldliness, bringing in the strange. The moon moves into Capricorn at 6:21 a.m., and this tells us that Saturday is an errand day. We're not going to take Saturday off. There's this sense of whether we're preparing for Halloween, and I know many people have a Halloween party on Saturday night, even though it's not Halloween, because that's Saturday night. But we're busy on Saturday, and Mercury and Venus are both busy. Mercury is making an exact quincunx with Jupiter now, and that Mercury-Jupiter quincunx is taking on too much, saying too much, doing too much. And Venus is connecting up with Neptune by a square and a half. And the sun will be right behind that in a couple of days. The thing is that there's a lot going on, but I don't see any of this as really long-lasting or significant in the long run. It's significant for today. We're busy. By midday, the Mercury moves out of Libra and into Scorpio, and by midday we have Mercury, the Sun, Venus, and the South Node all in Scorpio. So we're really having moved, even though it's not Halloween yet, we've moved into the darkness, into the other side of the veil that we sometimes associate with All Saints Day or Halloween, All Hallows Eve. The veil is already thin here. We don't have to wait until Halloween night. There's definitely stuff cooking, and that is Saturday, the 29th. On Sunday the 30th in the morning, this is when Mars actually is retrograde. It'll still show here in this chart with an S stationed, meaning it hasn't moved. If you look at this, on Friday, Mars is at 25 degrees 35 minutes. On Saturday, it's 25 degrees 36 minutes. On Sunday, it's 25 degrees 36 minutes. On Monday, it's 25 degrees 36 minutes. On Tuesday, now we see some motion, it's 25 degrees 34 minutes. But Mars is on the 30th. It begins its retrograde phase. And again, remember, Mars continues retrograding from this 25.5 degrees of Gemini all the way back to 8 degrees of Gemini, which means that any planets that you have between 25.5 and 8 degrees of Gemini is going to get it a second time when Mars moves retrograde over that point, and then a third time. And for that matter, if you have planets opposite Gemini in Sagittarius, or square to Gemini in Virgo or Pisces, you're going to get those Mars oppositions or squares 3 times. Now, if you have planets between 8 and 25 degrees of air, aside from Gemini, meaning 8 to 25 degrees of Libra or Aquarius, then Mars is going to trine those points 3 times. And that's always good to note, where do those mid degrees of Gemini fall in your natal or birth chart, because Mars hanging out there is going to heat up that part of your life, those circumstances having to do with the houses that Mars is retrograding in your chart. So that's on the 30th. Other than that, Thursday 30th is quiet. The moon makes a trine to Uranus and a sextile to Neptune. It's kind of a relatively easy day, but the Mars thing may be making us crazy. We may be a little bit of stir crazy. We want to go out, we want to do something, and that Mars station and or turning retrograde is just saying, hold still. You don't need to go anywhere or do anything. On the 31st, we get a little action again. And we have the Sun and Venus making square and a half sesqui-squares with Neptune and Mars. And you can see that the Neptune and Mars are still holding that square that they've been holding since mid-early October, the one that was exact for the first time on October 11th. But we now have, into that, we have Venus actually, it's Venus and the Sun that are taking turns making square and a halves, or is that squares and a half? Sesqui-squares with Neptune and Mars and Jupiter, creating a bit of tension. And that tension is, where do we go? What do we do with our passion, our intensity? It doesn't seem to fit in, and yet we have to make it fit in. By early mid-morning on Monday the 31st, the moon moves into Aquarius. That would be 8:42 a.m. Pacific time. So that's 11:42 a.m. Eastern time. And the moon moving through Aquarius is going to square Mercury and the Sun, and eventually Venus. It won't get to that until tomorrow, November 1st. But it's a bit of a dynamic day, but nothing off the charts. Although I think that Sun and Venus sesqui-squares to Mars and to Neptune, I think, can stir things up a little bit. And again, I think here the question is, how do we resolve what we don't know? If we don't know the boundary between what we know and what we don't know, it's hard to find finality, because we don't know where we are. We don't have a way of taking bearings. And I think that the Mars square Neptune through this whole period of time kind of keeps bringing us back around to that. So I just bumped into my version of the Mars slowing down, and I ran out of memory space on the card that I'm recording this on, so I had to stop everything and go off in search of another memory card and stick it in there. I am resuming now, but there'll be a little bit of a break in here, and so rather than trying to cover up and make it look smooth, I'm letting you know that I walked away and now have come back. And I just wanted to make the point that nodes are like wormholes or vortexes, because they seem to cross through time and space, and eclipses do that. They're like polarizers that switch out the energy, and it's why they can seem so intense. Often eclipses are interpreted negatively, and there are traditions in Vedic astrology that you don't want to go out under an eclipse because it's bad. Not my experience. I don't know. I can't really comment on it further. other than I think sometimes those things that we don't understand, we feel that they're bad. We call them bad. They're out of our control. And eclipses are that. And remember, an eclipse occurs when a new moon or full moon occurs close to the nodal axis. And so we have here on November 6th, the sun actually joins up with the node. I think it actually does it on the 5th. And so the sun is 1 degree away from the node on the 6th, and then by the time we get to the 8th, the sun at 16 degrees and the node is at 13, but it's still close enough that this is a total lunar eclipse because of the proximity of the full moon to, when I say the full moon, I mean both the moon and the sun degree-wise to the south node and north node of the moon. The thing, though, is that the moon moves into Taurus on November 6th, late in the day, in the evening, at 9:14 p.m., and Venus squares Saturn. Let's move this back to the 6th, and we can see that Venus square Saturn, Venus at 18, Saturn at 18, and Uranus at 17. So we're seeing this Saturn-Uranus square, the old and the new, with Venus into the picture. And Venus square Saturn can feel like we're ready to throw in our cards, where it's like, is it worth it? Gee, I don't know. We run into trouble and we think we're getting close to resolution or love or sweetness or our values being acknowledged, or just things. Resolution seems far away, even though election day here on the 6th is only a couple of days away. That Venus square Saturn might feel a bit negative. And remember, we're coming right off the Venus opposing Uranus, where we're excited and we're hoping for something different. And now it's like, well, what if it's the same as, and same old stuff, and nothing is resolved. On Monday, the 7th, Mercury makes a square and a half to Jupiter, and again, the sun had done this the day before. It's like Mercury-Jupiter sesqui-square, we can say too much. We can be too talkative. We can give away secrets. We can be bad at negotiating because we let the person we're negotiating with know more than they optimally should. But look here at the fact that this T-square is still really, really active. The Sun and Mercury are both coming into the opposition to Uranus. They're still conjoined widely, Mercury 1 degree and the Sun 2 degrees with the nodal axis. Venus is kind of escaping from the pack a little bit, and by Tuesday morning, and the actual time for the eclipse on the 18th, on November 8th, is at 3:02 a.m. And as we can now see, the sun is at 16 degrees 0 minutes Scorpio. The moon is at 16 degrees 0 minutes of Taurus. But we also have Uranus at 16 degrees partile conjunct, Uranus at 16 degrees of Taurus also. But we also have Mercury at 15, almost just barely, not quite, but 8 minutes away from 16 degrees. So Mercury is very close to the sun. And here on this eclipse morning, again now with Venus having separated from the pack, the sun square Saturn is about a 2 degree orb, and Venus square Saturn is almost 2 degrees. It's about 1.5 degrees. And so Saturn is still brought into that square even tighter than just the less than 2 degree orb that it is by itself Saturn almost at 19 Aquarius, Uranus almost at 17 Taurus. But it's tighter than it appears because the Venus and the Sun have a midpoint at about 18 degrees of Scorpio, which brings that in, it pulls in that Saturn even more so. So this is an incredibly powerful aspect, and as I said at the beginning, it's a very powerful chart. But it's a very complicated chart to read because Uranus is so prominent and the trickster Mercury is so prominent that this can go anywhere. And again, I will just say that looking at a chart like this, one is reminded that the Saturn square isn't enough to stabilize this chart, that we are getting something here that is exciting and maybe disheartening and maybe heartening. It just depends what side of which issues come out here. Remember, the idea of reading into a chart good or bad is difficult because what's bad for one person might be good for someone else. And yet there's that whole sense of the unpredictability of Uranus and a Uranus full moon eclipse. Might just mention in passing that Donald Trump was born on the day of an eclipse, and Uranus was conjuncting his sun in Gemini on the eclipse day that he was born. And so there's just something here about the eclipse energy, and I think we'll have to wait until mid-November at least to figure out what happened here. But it's my assumption that because Mars is still squaring Neptune, things are not as they appear to be. And so again, no matter what it is that we believe happens on election day, there's things that are going down that we're not going to get until the air is cleared, and that may take some time. We need to hang in there. We don't have any choice on this one. We're on a ride. We're on a roller coaster ride. And all we can do is hold on and breathe and be kind and compassionate as we can. And like I say, if you want to live in a democracy, then it's incumbent upon all of us adults to get out and vote, even though we may be voting for the lesser of two evils, or we may be voting for imperfection. It's, again, my position, and you certainly can have a different position than I do. But it's important, I believe, for us to do what we can to save at least the pretense of a democracy or of a government that is run for the people, of the people, and by the people. And with that, I'm going to end. Remind us, as always, to think cosmically, act locally, and I think more than ever, not only to act locally, but to pay attention also to what's going on locally, because it is a reflection of the cosmic. I'm Rick Levine, and I just want to extend my sincere appreciation to all of you who are patrons on patreon.com/Rick Levine. You enable this to happen, and so I appreciate you, and I will see you all on the first of the month.